Yeah, I've been working with Burrenbeo and the Hare's Corner for the past 2 years on something called the Plan for Nature. So what I want to do this evening is share some of the things that I've learned when I've been doing these plans, maybe outline to you how you can go about developing your own plan for nature, and give you a few tips on the things you can do on your own property to help nature. So during the 2 years, things now aren't changing. There we go. Um, Suddenly the broadband slowed down. So during these 2 years, I've visited probably 60 different places, and the big range from gardens, community things, which might be schools, they could be uh, GAA pitches or community projects, farmland and other areas which are businesses. And they varied a lot from small to large. Some have been quite intensively managed, like the gardens and some of the farmland, to places which have actually gone wild. Um, and it was really interesting because although they're quite different, there's a lot of similarities. And while some of them might not be providing a lot for nature and others are already doing a lot, every situation there's actually more you can do to improve and deliver more for nature. So when I'm developing a Hare's Corner, what I like to do is meet the landowner, walk the land with them and have a chat. Because what I'm trying to do is gauge their interests, their aims, their needs, any plans they've got, whether they want to put a polytunnel in, whether they want to run a business on part of the land, and what their knowledge of nature is, because I'm going to try and tailor the plan that I develop for them to those ends. Now, very interestingly, when I was talking to people, what came out was how many people lacked confidence. They said they felt overwhelmed, didn't know where to start, and a lot of people were terrified of doing the wrong thing and actually damaging nature. And some people said, well, I looked up, say, how to plant a hedge, and there seems to be so many different ways. And then my neighbour says you do it this way, my other neighbour says a different way. So they were overwhelmed by conflicting advice. And the impact this had was inertia or a paralysis. People just didn't have the confidence or didn't know where to start. So that's kind of what I'm hoping this talk's going to do. It's going to give you the confidence and some ideas about where you can start to do something for nature on your land. So the first thing to say is that there's no single right thing to do for nature or right way of doing it. There's many different ways of skinning a cat and many different ways of planting a hedge. And the biggest thing I can say is it's okay to make mistakes. If you make a mistake, you're not going to destroy the planet, and it's very unlikely that you're going to knock out a super rare species. And nature's actually quite forgiving of mistakes. So I suggest maybe to start off, you think about making a plan yourself, and it could be as simple as you like, one or two actions you might do, say, this year, or you could think down the line and maybe what you'd like to do over time and plan for the future. Because by doing this, hopefully it'll give you the confidence to actually start doing something for nature. Because if you can do something, anything for nature, that's going to be better to make a start than to do nothing at all. So hopefully that's what's going to come out of this. So when it comes to developing your own plan for nature, you need to think, what are your needs? This is going to have to work for you. And different people have got different situations. So for example, if you've a young family, you're not going to be able to manage all your lawn as a wildflower meadow. They've got to have somewhere to play. So, but there's ways you can build nature in around that. It might be that you've got a business. This bottom one is a dog park that was in Mayo. So again, they need to manage the grass for the dogs, but it's a way of looking at things that they can do around the field that could increase the value for nature over time. Then you need to think about, what would you like to do? After all, it's your land. Are your interests quite general, or are you particularly interested in, say, looking after the birds, or maybe you want to attract more butterflies, bees, and things, or look after your local hedgehog population? It doesn't really matter. Think about what you want to do and what you'd like to achieve for nature. Another thing to think about is, what's your capacity? A lot of things for nature actually don't take that much time, but they might have concerted pockets where you need more time. So what's your time availability? Some jobs are likely to be a bit more physical than others. You might need some tools and machinery for certain things. What's your budget? For example, if you've got to fence off trees, and have you got help available in the family or friends to come and give you a hand on the day to do some of the jobs? Really importantly, I'd say is also start by looking at what you've got already. And I like to say look with the eyes of a child because children have the advantage of the closer to the ground, they've generally got better eyesight than the rest of us as we get older. And they've got a natural curiosity. So they actually look and see. So that's what I'd say is walk around your property, have a look and see. Why do I underline see? Well, a lot of us look at things, but I'm not sure we actually see them. So I think of it maybe as looking at the broader canvas of, say, a garden or a field, and then zooming in, say, look at the trees, then look at the tree and look at what's on the tree. So you're looking at more at different layers and different levels of detail just to see what you've got already. So what existing habitats have you got in terms of trees, hedges, grass, flower beds, various types of water? Gravel drive can be a habitat, compost heaps and buildings, whether they're old buildings or your house itself. And what flora and fauna have you already got there? If it's a garden, what garden plants have you got, and what wildflowers have you got? And that includes things that you might dismiss initially as weeds like dandelions and nettles. We'll come back to those a bit later. And look at your wildlife. It's not just about the birds and the bigger things, it's all those little things, all the little insects, and not just the pretty ones like the bumblebees and the butterflies. It's all the little creepy crawlies and things. Just look, if you've got a good food chain, you're going to have lots of creepy crawlies. What's your soil and drainage like? If you've got very fertile soil, that's going to impact if you're trying to get a wildflower grassland. Is your drainage good or is it poor? If you've got waterlogged soils, again, you might be looking at a different endpoint than if you've got free draining soils. So you might have to adjust your expectations according to what soil and drainage you've got. Look at the light and shade. That's going to have an impact on what you've got to do. You're going to do as well. For example, you can't develop a wildflower meadow in a very place that's overshaded by a lot of trees, but you might be able to develop a more woodland flora or hedgerow flora there. Look, have you got non-invasive species, native invasive species there? Things like Japanese knotweed, Montbretia, other things that you might need to control and sort out along the way. And I'd also say phone a friend. More than one set of eyes is better. And if you've got a friend who's already tried a few things in their garden, or you know they've got a lot of birds coming in, get them to come and say why they've got things working for them and maybe explain how you could possibly achieve it on your own patch of land. The fifth thing you need to look at in terms of your patch of land is, are the needs of wildlife being met at this stage? And there's four main needs of wildlife, and the first one is food. Now, all too often we tend to think of food in terms of flowers, fruit, whether it be berries or nuts, and not much beyond it. But food for wildlife is a lot more than just those few things. An awful lot of things will eat leaves. Now, this poor cabbage has been shredded by caterpillars, but you'll often have caterpillars feeding on trees in your garden and you're not going to notice they're there. You'll have things that are feeding on the sap on the plants. You have things that are feeding on dead wood, like these beetle larvae that had emerged. You'll have other animals that live by breaking down dead matter. There's a whole host of wildlife that lives in our soil. And the thing is, it's really important to have all these separate things because it creates a larger food chain, a more complicated food chain and food web. And you need that if you want to attract the more iconic things like your birds, your mammals. Because, for example, if want to attract blue tits, they need to have things to feed on. They're going to feed on small insects, whether it's spiders, little flies, or green fly. When they're raising their young, they need caterpillars to feed their young. So it's the caterpillars off the trees that are going to feed those. So it's about providing as much food as you can. So yeah, so just to reiterate, what site is your site providing in terms of food? Now it's easier to see what it's providing in terms of flowers and fruit. A lot of the others will happen naturally. You need to be providing a diverse type and when needed. So some animals need food year round. Some are only going to need it at certain times of the year. But if you can have food available year round, that's going to be better for wildlife. is the fresh water. All wildlife needs fresh water, whether for drinking, bathing, and of course aquatic life, like aquatic water beetles, frogs, newts, are all going to need water at some point. The third thing I split into two levels, and that's shelter. The first one I think about is day-to-day shelter, and that's the shelter that's going to protect things from the weather and from predators. So it might be somewhere that insects can hide from the birds that are going to eat them. Small birds can hide from the bigger birds, like the sparrowhawk that's going to eat them. So that's really important from a day-to-day living. But then there's a different type of shelter, and it's that shelter where animals breed and overwinter. So places where, say, a bird can build a nest, a shrew can build a nest, bees can build their nests, they're quite very important. And things where animals that overwinter as adults, like some of our butterflies and other insects, where they can find the shelter that they need for the winter. And the final thing is, are you carrying out wildlife friendly management? And that's going to be in terms of avoiding the use of herbicides and pesticides as much as possible, if not fully, and maybe learning to embrace a level of untidiness, at least somewhere on your property, because wildlife does like a bit of what we consider to be untidiness. So, having looked at your property and decided what it's been delivered or what isn't being delivered, what can you do to provide for those needs? And I'm going to give a few tips and recommendations now, and they're quite limited. They're some of the main things that come up in most of the plans, because otherwise Pranchely will be shooting me, because I'll be still talking in 2 or 3 hours time, not in hopefully 40 minutes. The first thing most people want to talk about is trees, and planting trees in particular. Trees are really important. They provide food, shelter. They give structural diversity that adds complexity to habitats. They also help to connect different habitats and allow wildlife to move through the landscape. But it's not just about planting trees. People often ask me if they should remove trees. So what I'd actually say is, first, keep any existing mature trees you've got, even if they're non-native species. A lot of people are surprised by that. For example, like sycamore, beech, and even Sitka spruce can be delivering for wildlife if they're mature, because they develop lots of things that will have started to grow on them, mosses, lichens, which are going to support all the life. And also they develop nooks and crannies where bats might roost, birds might nest and things. So if you were to fell them and try and replace that habitat, it's going to be many, many years before your new trees get to that size to be delivering those little niches for nature. So first off, keep your mature trees. When it comes to planting trees, it's really a case of what tree and where. And it's all about the right tree in the right place. What's the right tree? Well, we're talking really native Irish species. And ideally, if you've got the space to plant a mix of some that are insect pollinated and some that are wind pollinated. Examples of insect pollinated are things that generally have showier flowers, like crabapple, mountain ash, that sort of thing, whitethorn. And wind pollinators tend to have catkins more, or smaller, less showy flowers, things like alder, hazel, and the oak species. And if you are planting things which are insect pollinated, look to plant ones that are going to flower at different dates to extend the feeding season, because different insects are going to be appearing at different times in the year. You should go for trees that are grown from Irish seed and Irish grown, not just Irish native species. You can go into a garden centre, you can buy a tree might be grown from seed that came from Spain. That's not going to flower at the same time as a tree that is adapted to Ireland. It's not going to be adapted to the climate here. So it's not just a native species, it should be from Irish seed, and it should be Irish grown, because a lot of Irish seed is actually exported to places like Holland and grown up to the saplings, and the saplings then come back, and of course that has the issue of it can bring disease back into the country with it and cause problems. So look for local nurseries which are growing from Irish seed and guaranteed Irish seed and Irish grown. When it comes to the right place, One of the things that worries me quite a lot is a lot of people see trees as being the only thing you do for nature. Well, it isn't. If you go and plant your trees on an existing habitat, like the only bit of your field that already has more wildflowers in it, you're going to destroy a habitat. And it's going to take the trees quite a long time to develop that habitat. So you should always look at what's there before. Don't plant it on a flowery area or other valuable habitats. Um, Again, you might need to consider your soil pH and drainage because different trees will cope with different things. If you're thinking of planting an orchard, as was in this case in the photo, and you dig a hole and it's flooded and it stays flooded, your apple trees are not going to do very well there. So maybe look at your drainage. Some trees will cope here, mainly willows and things like alder. Also, exposure, if you're on the coast or in very windy places, certain trees are not going to do as well. And in those cases, I'd say look at what's already growing in the locality because they're the ones that are adapted, and then plant that sort of tree on your own land. Other thing to think about, you're planting these, they're quite small, but how big are they going to grow and how much shade are they going to cast? Because that's going to have an impact in the years to come, both on other habitats and maybe your enjoyment. If you plant a load of trees and then in 20 years your house is continuously in darkness and shade, it's not going to be fun. So it might influence where you actually choose to plant different trees and maybe the type of canopy of the tree that you'd go, say, for lighter canopies like birch and things in some cases, and trees that grow smaller. So just think about what you want to place and what's the right place for your tree. So once you've planted them, you also need to look after them a bit, to give them the right care. And in some cases, that means providing protection, particularly when they're young. Ironically, for considering a lot of trees have been given out and planted under the hare's corner, hares actually do quite a lot of damage. You see quite a lot of them where the hares have come and nipped off the top of the tree. That's not too bad, but if they've then gone on to debark trees, young saplings, they'll kill them off. So in those situations, you might need to be looking at putting a tree guard in. If you've got planting in an area where there's livestock or you've got deer, you might need to be looking at fencing them off so they're not going to get eaten until they're big enough to cope with some browsing. You're going to have to manage the vegetation around them. Saplings are quite small. If the vegetation's strong, you get strong grass growth or other weeds like bindweed and goosegrass. That can swamp these small trees, cut out the light, and they're just going to die. So you need to manage your vegetation around them. And that can be as simple as trampling it down. If you go in with a strimmer, you're as likely to cut your little sapling down as the grass. So trample it down. Some people use cardboard. I don't think that works necessarily very well. It gets wet and the grass grows through. Or you could put a mulch down around them to keep the vegetation just till they've got established and got their head above the height of the surrounding vegetation. And increasingly, we're getting situations where we're getting spring droughts. So if you're planting saplings and you don't get them in till, say, February, March in particular, and then you've got a drought in April or May, they're not going to have had time for their roots to start to establish. So you might need to look at watering them a little bit during the first year. You don't want to water unless it's needed, because actually having a little bit of a lack of water will help the roots to develop out and go spread out looking for water. But if we do have a drought, it will help them to survive if you give them some water. Now, while a lot of people ask about trees, very few, or I'd say next to no people ever ask about hedges. And hedges can actually deliver a lot more for wildlife than trees quite quickly in many cases. Those do the same as trees, but they're another good option. If you look at the best hedges for nature, they're the ones that have a diversity of native shrubs in. They tend to be thicker and taller, so say a minimum of 2 meters thick, 2 meters tall. They'll include standard trees. Those are ones that are allowed to grow up to maturity. You don't want them too close, else they'll shade out your lower shrubbery and your hedge will get quite bare and gappy. Ideally, they'd have a ditch or a bank on them and a wilder strip on either side, preferably up to a minimum of 1 to 2 meters. And they should be sympathetically managed. And by sympathetically managed, I'm not flailed to the nub of nothing. They should really not be cut every year. because a lot of shrubs like whitethorn that will only flower on 2-year-old wood. So if you're going and cutting it back all the time, it's not going to be able to flower. If you cut too early, you're going to take off all the fruit, the haws or the nuts that would feed the wildlife in winter. So sympathetic management can be that you don't cut your hedges too often. You cut hedges in rotation on a property, so there's always some food, and that maybe you don't um, cut them too tightly in. A lot of gardens, the hedges are really poor for nature. Things like griselinia and a lot of the laurel hedges, they provide next to nothing. In theory, they provide cover and connectivity, but funnily enough, my experience of, say, griselinia, which I absolutely detest, is that I don't see that many birds using it compared to other hedges. So if you are going to plant a hedge, maybe try and plant a more diverse hedge first off. If you've got a griselinia hedge, maybe look at lopping some bits out of it and planting a few other things in to make it more diverse. This hedge is very slightly better. It's not a native plant, it's beech, it's near native, it's native in Britain. And embarrassingly, this is actually my own hedge. If I was to plant a hedge again, I wouldn't plant this hedge. I'd do it differently. But it does provide more in terms of food for wildlife. It gets quite a lot of aphids on it, which then get eaten by birds, and the honeydew, for some reason, that attracts a lot of worker bees into the hedge. So again, really, if you want to do a good hedge, it's something that's going to mimic this hedge up here, which is a more natural hedge. So you've got your mixed species, which are in here. The guy who planted this hedge has things he's going to let go up to trees. He's going to lay this hedge initially to make it more stock proof, and then it's going to be left and only managed maybe every 5 to 10 years if he needs to cut it then. So there's lots of things you can do. You're going to have to adapt them to your circumstances. I mean, you can't have a 2x2 hedge in a small garden. So it's really about looking at what's practical for you, but trying to get as many of these things in to some level that will deliver for nature. Next thing that comes up in an awful lot of wildflower, the plans for nature, the wildflower meadows or wildflower grasslands. And I have to say, this is probably one of the most misunderstood habitats out. And part of the problem is there's an awful lot of companies out there now selling what they say is Irish wildflower seed or Irish wildflower meadow. And when you plant it, you get something that looks like this. It's full of cornflowers, poppies, corn marigolds. And what I call this is a picture or ornamental meadow. And I actually wouldn't use the term meadow. There's no grass in this. If you want a meadow, it needs to have grass in it. Meadows are basically grasslands. This isn't a grassland. This is actually an arable weed mix. Most of these species are the things that when you ploughed historically and planted your wheat crop or your oats, you'd get a lot of these plants appearing. We've lost them now after all the seed cleaning. And the thing is, if you plant one of these, it might look good for a year or two, but then it's going to disappear. And I've come across so many people who planted these things thinking they're doing the right thing. And then after 2 years, it's gone, and they're really disappointed, and that people are giving up. And it's because it wasn't a grassland to start with. What I'd say is, if you want this pretty mix of flax, you can have it, but it's going to have a lower nature value than a proper grassland. You could plant it in a flower bed, but you should never ever buy these wildflower seed mixes that are being planted and being promoted by companies and plant it outside a garden for a lot of reasons that I don't have time to go into. Now, both of these are actually wildflower grasslands. Top one, less showy. The bottom one is a top class Burren grassland. Now, you might look at the top one and say, well, that's not wildflower grassland. Well, it's got 2 different types of clover in, it's got buttercups, it's got other wildflowers in. It's not as showy as the bottom one, but it is a wildflower grassland. And these are properly functioning grasslands, and they're both going to support more wildlife than this arable weed mix on this side. At the end of the day, it's really about trying to develop your grassland. Now, again, a lot of us will have to temper our expectations, because this top grassland with a few added flowers might be the best we can get, and it is good for wildlife and for nature. This bottom one is really hard to get. It's all about making the grassy patches we have the best grasslands they can be for biodiversity. And again, if you're in a place that has poorly drained waterlogged soils, you're going to get a wet grassland developed. It's going to look very different to this Burren grassland at the bottom, even to this grassland here. So you've really got to accept what your land is capable of in terms of grassland. Now, when it comes to managing wildflower grasslands, I'm going to focus on lawns, because I think a lot of people who are dialing in will have smaller areas of grassland, lawns or mini meadow type areas. The principles can be the same for a larger grassland area. And there's two ways of doing it that are generally talked about now. The first is a long flowering meadow, which tries to mimic a traditional hay meadow. And it's called long flowering because it's taller, longer vegetation, and it has a longer flowering period than the second type of management I'll talk about. Now, the aim of the long flowering meadow is to allow as many plants to flower and set seed as possible, because this is going to have the maximum benefit for wildlife. If you want to do one of these, the question is, where should you start? So if you've got a lawn or a bit of grassland, try and identify areas where you've already got more wildflowers. You might know that oxidases come up in some parts. Look also at where your grass growth is weaker, because that's generally where you're going to get more wildflowers first. It's less fertile. The other thing you can do is, if you're not sure, is just go and look at leaves. The more different leaf shapes there are there, the more wildflowers there are already that, if you reduce your mowing, are going to be able to flower. And what I'd also say is, if you're starting a long flowering hay meadow, start with a manageable area. And this is actually the Cusack Centre, which has visitors, so they wanted the place to look a bit tidier. But we looked at the lawn they had and identified areas where there were more oxidases and other flowers naturally, and they just started leaving those bits as long flowering meadow. They look quite nice. The trouble is, if they'd left this whole area to as long flowering meadow, a lot of grass would have been strong, would have fallen and looked messy. And I've come across a lot of people who say, oh, I tried to do a wildflower meadow, the grass got long, it looked a mess, and I just cut it. So this isn't necessarily always the place to start. So choose a manageable area of your grassland first to try this out on. How do you go about doing this? Well, generally the first cut you do is around March, and then you don't cut it again until late August or September. Now, this is actually later than you would cut a hay meadow, and the reason for that is you're trying to maximize the number of plants that get a chance to flower and set seed, because by allowing them to set seed, then you're going to increase the numbers of flowers over the years. You can do the first cut, if it's a smallish area, you can often do with your lawnmower. If you're doing the second cut, you're looking at maybe doing a side, a strimmer. If you're using a strimmer, I'd say don't use the ones with the line on, that mulches the grass, which makes it hard to collect. Try and do one with the cutting blade. Or if it's a small enough area, you can even do it with hand tools like a set of shears or whatever in the early stages. When you do cut them, the grass cuttings, you want to leave them for a few days and maybe turn them if possible. And that's to maximize the amount of seed that they drop, which are going to increase your flowers over the next few years. Then you have to remove the grass cuttings. What you're trying to do is lower the fertility. And if you're growing up the grass and removing it, you're taking fertility away. If you leave it to rot down, it's going to actually create a layer that suppresses the germination of the new seeds, but it's also going to keep the fertility up higher. You can boost it over time by collecting local wild flower seed growing locally. And the other thing you can do is add yellow rattle. A lot of people refer to yellow rattle as the meadow maker. If you're a farmer, it's a meadow destroyer, because it's going to weaken your grass. You're going to have a very light hay crop. It's a wildflower meadow maker. And the reason is because this parasitizes the grasses. It can help weaken the grasses and reduce the competition, which allows more flowers to actually grow. If you're putting in yellow rattle, you want to use fresh seed. That's seed that's been gathered sort of late summer. Burrenbeo collect every year and have it for sale sort of around August. You want to plant it as quickly as possible, I've had a number of people who say I planted it, it didn't grow, but they've actually planted in quite wet areas, and it's not that fond of really wet ground. So if your land is damper, put it in the drier areas first, and it will build up. And the most important thing is if you've sown yellow rattle, this is an annual plant. So it grows, it flowers, and it sets seeds in 1 year, and it will not grow again from its roots. It has to grow from that seed it dropped that year. So if you cut it off, you're not going to, before it sets seed, you're not going to have the seed and you'll knock it out very quickly. So if you've got yellow rattle, don't cut it till the seeds are ripe and dropping. So generally, nearly said January, you're going to be talking about cutting in late July at the earliest, preferably August. Depends on the area you're in. Okay, so the other option is called the short flowering meadow, and I actually recommend that people maybe look at combining this with a long flowering meadow when they're first starting out. And the reason it's called short flowering meadow is it's got shorter vegetation because you're mowing more often, and it's got a shorter flowering period. And the main aim of this is to allow some plants to flower because this is going to provide food, particularly for pollinators, whether it's bees, butterflies, or whatever. So it's going to be plants that are historically could cope better with grazing or and can cope better with mowing, that they'll flower more quickly, that if you mow them off, you're not knocking out that the flowers for that year. So dandelions, daisies, red white clover, and this plant here, which is self-heal. Now, one of the other advantages of having some areas of short flowering meadow is that quite a lot of birds, like the thrush family, thrushes and blackbirds, find it much easier to get at the worms and invertebrates in the soil to feed on if you've got short grass compared to long grass. And the poster flower of a lot of people who are starting out in trying to do wildflower meadows is the bee orchid. Everybody loves the bee orchid. Now, because they actually overwinter as a leaf rosette, they prefer growing in places that are kept a bit shorter, because if there's too much other vegetation, because they've got very low-lying leaves, they can get shaded out. So quite often I find in my garden, the bits that I tended to mow a short flowering meadow are where I start seeing more bee orchids coming in every year. And then of course you spot them as they're coming up and you have to mow round them. Where to start? Well, it's like the last one. Start with areas where you can already see different wildflowers, weaker grass. And you can either go for your whole lawn like this, or you can do some areas where you'll try long flowering, or it might just be that you choose a small patch that's suitable and manageable and fits in. So it might be you've got a lot of area left for the children to play in, but you've got also a little bit that's allowed to flower a bit longer. How do you manage this? Well, the first cut, I would say you could do to tidy up before the dandelions start flowering. So that might be February, early March. But then the main cut is going to be late April after your dandelions finish flowering. And the reason you're letting your dandelions through is dandelions are just an absolute powerhouse when it comes to nature. They're one of the first things to appear. If you look at them on a sunny day in sort of March, April, you'll often see loads of little beetles, flies, little solitary bees on there. We all love seeing another yellow plant appear in spring, the daffodil. That's next to useless for wildlife. So, I mean, really try and look after your dandelions. Because particularly for things that have overwintered, so queen bumblebees as they appear, it's a really important foodstuff for them. A lot of butterflies, when they first appear, they've overwintered as adults, will feed on dandelions. You can then go and cut it if you've got grass that's growing more quickly and stronger. You might do them every 4 weeks. If it's weaker, every 6 weeks. So you could go then, say early June, mid-July, late August for your cuts. One thing is, what you're trying to do is cut the grass more and keep your grass maybe a little bit tidier, if that's your mindset. But set your mower blades high. That's going to allow things like clover and self-heal to flower much more quickly. They might start flowering again a week after you've cut it, compared to if you skin it right down to soil level. And if you've got different areas, maybe don't cut it all at once. Stagger your cutting. So you cut maybe one area every second week or something. And that's going to mean that even though you've cut an area, you've got other areas that are still going to be in flower. So you're going to have food always available in your garden for the insects that are feeding on it. Again, like the long flowering, you need to remove the grass cuttings. If you don't feel you can even manage this, maybe look at just doing no mow May. And again, that's really about allowing these early things like dandelions to flower when food is in such short supply before lots of other wildflowers and garden flowers and hedgerow plants are coming into flower. And if you do start with a short flowering meadow, what you find is that over time they might start to become a little bit more species rich, and you could consider letting some of those to transition into long flowering meadow. And that's what I actually did in my garden. So this is just to show you what you can achieve. This is my own little lawn. And it's the transformation between 2007. It's actually happened earlier than 2020, but I didn't have some earlier photos. Initially, when I moved into this house in 2005, I was trimming the grass. It hadn't been cut all summer. I found a couple of dead orchids and I thought, great wildflower meadow. 2006, I didn't mow the grass and it looked awful. Grass was strong. It got lodged. Dogs flattened it all. It just didn't really work. So I think the second year I left a few bits that look more species rich. As you can see here, the dog's still playing on it, uncut, but the other bits I was cutting more sort of every 4 to 6 weeks. That was allowing that's actually self-healed there to flower. And over time, it eventually changed this. But what was the main reason that drove that? Well, I'd say yellow rattle. I introduced yellow rattle in 2007, and that did take off and really has weakened the grass right out. And the right management. I started managing it as the long flowering meadow. So I was only cutting it really September, October. I left it even later initially. The soil's not that fertile, that I could reverse the fertility quite quickly, and the drainage is quite good. There was probably a decent enough seed bank here already, and in some areas you're quite lucky you will have a good enough seed bank. Just if things aren't mown off, there's a lot of plants that are there that you don't realise. And I added seed that I'd collected locally over time. And one of the most important things, again, is to give these things time. Now, I did start off with a smaller wildflower meadow. I have some bits that I cut more often, like the path to the shed. And now suddenly my long flowering meadow is expanding because I keep getting more and more interesting things popping up all at the time. But it does take time, and over time you'll multiply up. You might start off with 10 orchids, goes to 70 orchids. I have in about 10 by 6 square meters over 400 orchids flowering over every year now. And once you've got all that increase in the amount of flowers, you'll get a lot more wildlife coming in that feeds on those. Moving on, water. What I'd say is whatever is practical, put water in. If you've got enough area to put in a big pond, put in a big pond. If you can't put in a big pond, put in a little pond. Again, this is my pond that I put in during lockdown. Quite small, but it attracts so much, particularly the birds. The birds just think it's the greatest bird bath on the planet. If you're putting in a pond, maybe look for a naturally damp spot on your land. If it's free drainage soil like mine is, you're going to have to look at using a pond liner. Choose a sunny spot. A lot of the insects and that are going to do better in a pond that's in a sunny place. If you're putting in a small pond, having some shade is good because they can heat up too much with the smaller volume of water. And it might be that they're in a place where they get morning light and then they might get a bit of shade through the sunniest bit of the day and then more light again later on in the day. Wildlife ponds don't need to be deep. In fact, a lot of pond life prefers the sort of 10 centimetre type depth. You can actually not dig a hole on your property deeper than 1 metre deep without planning permission. Most people don't realise that. And when you dig in the pond, look to create an area that will grade from a slightly deeper area. Maximum my pond is 60 centimetres into shallows, and plenty of shallows. That's where more wildlife's going to be. If you can have an irregular margin, all the better. It's going to create more niches for wildlife, and they should have safe access and exit for wildlife. Even if you're doing a mini pond, like my pond here, it's deepest in this bit, then it goes shallow, and it's got this little stone beach, so the hedgehog can go down to drink to the water and get out. Don't put ornamental fish in them. That's called a fish pond, and they eat all the wildlife. If you want a fish pond, have a fish pond, but it's not going to be a wildlife pond. And avoid introducing non-native invasive plants. And you really need to be careful when you're buying from garden centres. You might buy a marsh marigold, and you can get a fragment of something like lagrosiphon. I can't remember the common name off the top of my head, which happened to a friend of mine, and that took over the pond. So do be careful where you get your plants from. And in a lot of cases, just you don't really need to plant plants. If there's things in the vicinity, they'll come in naturally. If it's a pond in parts of the Burren, you might have to add things because it'll take a long time otherwise for things to find the way. Water doesn't have to be a pond. This was a place I'd visited. They dug a hole with a view to actually drain it off their garden, and they realised they had a pond. Now they've got two very young children, so they were worried about having a pond. They didn't really want to fence it off. Didn't think it looked aesthetically very good in the garden. So what we decided to do with this was actually put a leaky liner in for when it's not so wet. Backfill with the soil, and then plant some wetland type plants in, a lot of which would be the plants you see growing marginally around the edges of pond anyway, which would bring in a lot of insects that like moisture. If it comes to it, you can't do any of that. Put in a bird bath, just some sort of shallow water that's going to allow small mammals to come and drink, birds to come and drink, even bees will come and drink at it, wasps will come and drink at it. So some level of water, whatever. Another habitat which is really overlooked is dead wood. Dead standing wood or dead fallen wood is a really important habitat, and an awful lot of things like some beetles whose larvae might spend 2-3 years munching the way through wood to help it decay have become very rare because we've tended to over tidy the countryside and cut down all our dead wood. So if you can introduce some dead standing wood into your property, that's really going to create a good solid foundation to build a food chain that will support lots of birds and mammals along the way. In terms of dead standing, it's not always practical. A lot of us now have dying ash trees. If they're in a place where they're not going to cause a problem, you can just leave them. If they're not, and you do need to fell them, instead of cutting them right down to the ground, maybe cut them at, say, 4 foot high and leave the dead standing stump. That's still going to attract a lot of life that's going to feed on it. Or mimic dead fallen wood and create a log pile. This can be really good if you put it next to a pond, because it's going to give you pond life place to shelter, because like things like newts and frogs don't spend their whole life in the pond. They only go into the water really to breed. So it gives them somewhere to come out, which is shady and moist to shelter. And if you've got dead wood, over time you get fungi and other microbes come in to break it down. You then get things that come in and feed on the microbes and the algae and the plants that grow through it. Then you get a whole series of predators, from little predators like this mite through millipedes, centipedes, ground beetles, all of which then act as food for things like frogs, shrews. Then they act as food for other things. So a bit of dead standing wood is, as I say, is a really good way to kickstart a good food chain in a property. And there's other ways you can do it. We're quite often in situations where we're pruning things, cutting things down, and we have brash. This is a bigger situation where somebody had to fell a spruce tree and just piled up some of the branches and left it. This is myself and my friend at Christmas were letting some light into Hare Pond and been pruning some trees around it, and we topped up a brash pile we'd made a few years before. And these are great because they give lots of shelter for insects. You get a lot of spiders in them, you get birds going in after those for food, you might get wrens and some blue tits nesting in some of these, and hedgehogs and wood mice and shrews going in to use them as habitat. These can look a bit messy unless you've got a way off bit you can hide it behind. Another option is a dead hedge. Again, this is another one we did at Christmas. I mean, what else do you do at Christmas but go out in freezing cold and make dead hedges? And this one is, we made a few of these now. We put a few stakes in. We wove willow that we had in between it and then filled it with, we'd had to fell a willow tree that was growing too close to some electric wires. And while we could use the main trunk and that for other reasons, it was what to do with all the small brash. So we literally just filled the dead hedge with it, and then you can top these up in coming years as this rots down. And these are great. As I say, we've done a few of these, and always in winter. And the temperature was about 2 degrees when we were doing this, and we suddenly looked and there was a ladybird. The ladybirds always come and see what you're up to, and quite sometimes you'll get birds coming in. The wrens will come in. We had goldcrests coming in. Immediately these were being built. So they serve two purposes. They help you get rid of your garden waste without having to take it off to the tip somewhere, and they provide habitat at the same time. Another thing, if you've got a more formal garden, you might want to think about garden plants for food, for wildlife, particularly your pollinators. And it's not rocket science. You want to plant things that have got a good nectar and pollen source. Quite a lot of the old style cottage garden type plants or herbs, although they're not native, can be really good in the amount of pollen and nectar they produce. Avoid any double flowered and F1 hybrids because they generally are very poor at providing nectar and pollen. Double flowered plants, often the double flower is new or extra petals are adapted from the nectaries and that, so there's no nectar, or it might stop the insects getting in to get at the food. Aim for as long a flowering season as possible. I heard someone say what you should do is go into the garden centre every month and buy something that's flowering. And you'll get something that will flower every month of the year or most of the months of the year. I like to look at things like wallflowers, nice early flowers, then aquilejahs come in, and then other things all start flowering after that. Aim for a variety of different shapes, colours and scents, because they're going to attract different insects. Some have longer tongues, so can get into deeper flowers. Others have to feed on open flowers. And if you get things that produce a scent, particularly at night, you can bring in a lot of, you can have what they call, say, a moon garden that brings in a lot of nocturnal insects, a lot of the moths. So things like honeysuckle, night-scented stock. And you can attract, do quite a lot for wildlife, or boost your garden for wildlife by planting things like this. Again, avoid pesticides, even friendly ones. For example, if you look, you've got green fly here. If you go and spray that with soapy water, friendly pesticide, it kills the aphids. What are your ladybirds and their larvae going to feed on if you've killed the aphids? So you won't, if you want the ladybirds, you have to put up with some aphids. Thing is, you'll often have the aphids and think, oh God, that's looking bad. And then you'll go another day and they've been hoovered up by the predators that come in. And try not to be too tidy. At the end of the year, leave some of the dead matter. You'll get quite often little things going in to dry plant stems and overwintering in them, and in under the dead vegetation that's covering the soil. So try to be a little bit untidy in your approach. I just want to say a little bit about bees, because a lot of people ask me about bees and say, we're going to get a beehive. And I say, why? And they say, for pollinators. And I say, you get honeybees for honey. They're actually they've got an awful lot of workers in a beehive. You can have 50,000 workers, and they're going to go out and strip an awful lot of pollen and nectar that's available in the landscape. Now, some landscapes have plenty of food. Others' food is quite tight, and they can take it away from our native pollinators, our bumblebees and our solitary bees. So we've around 100 bees in Ireland, 20 of which are bumblebees, and the rest are solitary bees that are either miners, mason bees, leaf cutters, or cuckoo bees. And a lot of these are small, like this one. They don't look particularly like what we'd think of as a bee, but these are really important pollinators. They're often more efficient pollinators than honeybees and bumblebees, because they're less efficient at carrying pollen. Going backwards. And where a lot of these, 80% of these are mining bees, and they live in soils. So if you've got a sunny bank, free draining bank, you'll often see little holes in it. And these are the nests created by these bees. Or sometimes if you've got bare earth, again, you'll see these little volcanoes appearing. And that's where these are building their nests. And it's these ones, if you want to look after wildlife, this is the bees you want to be thinking about more than the honeybees. You can provide bee hotels. Big ones are not good, so they shouldn't be any bigger than a bird box, really. And there's relatively few use these. This one's been in my garden. It's been used by leaf cutters that are cutting leaves out of the beech hedge and then using those to create their cells. Or you can create your own little bee bank. And this was one we did at a friend's because these solitary bees are really good pollinators of soft fruits, and she was planting soft fruits, and I persuaded to do this. And all it was about 60 centimeters long by 40 centimeters wide. We put some rocks round it to stop the soil drifting, but it did. Packed the soil quite tightly, and literally within half an hour of putting this in, the first solitary bees started using it. As she said, it was like Heathrow Airport for the summer, with different species of solitary bee that emerge at different times of the year coming and using this. Now, 3 years on, it's got quite grassy. We tried to keep it weeded, but I think they do have a lifetime. What we'll probably leave is this one for a year to let everything emerge, build a new one somewhere else, which is going to be barer, and then eventually in another year or two get rid of the original one. Again, bumblebees, a lot of them like to nest in places where there's long grass. So if you can leave some long grass on the edge of your property, that's going to be where your bumblebees are going to build their nests. And another thing we can do for nature on our property is we can learn to love things that at the moment we dislike or hate and just don't appreciate. And that's weed scrub and messy corners. Dandelions, as I've said already, absolute powerhouse for nature. So learn to love our dandelions. They deliver so much. Once they've stopped providing pollen and nectar, they produce seeds which are loved by things like goldfinch will come and eat them, greenfinch, chaffinch will come and eat them. Nettles. I go to some sites and the most biodiverse site is the nettle patch growing around the septic tank. They can be brilliant. We all like butterflies. Well, some of our common butterflies, the small tortoiseshell and the peacock, their caterpillars feed on nettles, particularly those growing in sunny places. Now, nettles in Britain and Ireland support about 30 different species of insects are more or less dependent on them. And then you've got another 100 insects, birds, and that which will use them at some point for food. This is the burnished brass moth. Again, its caterpillars feed on nettles. So nettles can be great for wildlife. Okay, you don't really want them to take over everywhere, but if you can keep a small nettle patch in a sunny location, do. You can trim it back to stop it spreading, but they do have a benefit. And the same goes for thistles. Thistles, when they come into flower, all the bees, butterflies, beetles, flies, all just flock to them. So much food. And then you've got the thistle down again, providing seed later. And this is one of the ones I've had to learn to love in many ways. This is common hogweed, and it started coming up in my own garden. And it's brilliant. I call it the bonking beetle flower because it always attracts lots of soldier beetles, which come and have an orgy on it in the garden. But it can get quite big and take over a quite small grassland. It was blowing in from other gardens initially. So for years, I let it flower. Once the flowers had gone over, I'd cut it off so it wasn't setting seed. But last autumn, I actually dug out a lot of the roots to try and reduce it. I don't want to get rid of it altogether, but I do want to manage it in the situation. And then the scrub. We all love blackberries. Blackberries are really important for wildlife in terms of they flower for a long time, so lots of food for pollinators. Birds, small mammals will eat the blackberries as well as us. Ivy. So many people say, oh, ivy kills trees. It won't kill a tree. It won't strangle a tree. The tree, it expands. It's just climbing up the tree. When it will kill a tree is a tree that is coming to the end of its life anyway, and it might get into the canopy and cut out the light. But of course, as we know from the storm that's just happened, it will make trees more liable to wind throw. But it is so valuable because Ivy is one of the things that flowers latest in the year. So this will be flowering in sort of September. And it's where all the bumblebee queens that are going to overwinter, where a lot of butterflies that are going to overwinter as adults, hoverflies, are all going to go flocking to this to get the pollen and nectar that's been provided by this plant. And then, of course, late in the winter, you've got all the berries, which are fed on by blackbirds, thrushes, our native species that live here, and things that migrate for the winter, like fieldfares and redwings, are all going to come in and eat ivy. Again, it's not a case of letting it run riot, but if you can tolerate some ivy, and you might have to manage it some years, but if you can let it flower and fruit, if it starts getting higher up into the canopy of the trees, then you trim it back in some years. But just learn to love it, because nature really does love these some of these things and a lot more. It's just we've cast them as sort of the evil things that we don't want. I mean, a weed is just something that's growing in the wrong place. According to us, if a plant's growing, it thinks it's in the right place. Okay, so quickly coming on to devising your own plan for nature. So when it comes to sort of putting these things into practice, maybe you want to look at your ideas and options. What would you like to do? Where, when, and how? Are you going to maintain existing habitats, improve them, or create them? So, for example, in this garden, you've got quite a nice hedgerow. Maintain that. You could improve it by adding in a few tree species that will be allowed to grow up. Do you want to create a new habitat? Maybe plant a new hedge along this hedge, or divide the long lawn by planting a hedge across it. Think what's realistic and achievable, and always go for some quick wins. And the reason I say this is, if you do something that you see wildlife responding to, you're going to get a feel-good feeling, and that's going to make you more inclined to carry on. So look at the quick win situations, and providing water in any form, even if it's a small mini pond or a bird bath, is going to do that. Look at tackling your jobs in bite-sized, manageable pieces instead of going at them all whole hog. This lawn had not been cut in years, and it's thick matted grass. So if you went to try and cut all this in a year, it's going to be awful hard work, and it might break you. So instead of trying to do it all in one go, what you could do is look at opening up the path. This is actually a wildlife path that's running through it. You could open that path up to, say, 1 metre or 2 metres wide, and you could target some areas where there's already more wildflowers and just cut those. So it could be 2 square meters, it could be 5 square meters, instead of trying to do it all in one go. And once you've got that managed, you can start to expand out and manage other areas. And another thing is, there's a lot of people are buying older properties, particularly younger people who are looking for a better lifestyle, and they might have a field. Now, the trouble is, they've got a house they have to build, or a house they have to make habitable. Often, because of young people, they're starting a family. They've got a field. 10 years later, 5-10 years later, when they can do something with it, they look at it and it's turned into a wilderness. And they then are going to find it very hard to get back to use it for what they want it for, which often does have wildlife in mind. So if you've got something like that, I mean, fine, if you want to rewild it, let it rewild. But if you want to maybe plant orchards in it at a later date, when you've got some finance, some trees and that, look at holding management. Can you find somebody who's going to graze it for you, or maybe cut the grass on it, mow the grass for it? And most of all, I'd say, when you're looking and developing your plan for nature, take your time and allow nature time. A lot of ponds you go to, particularly bigger ponds where they've had diggers in, they're very muddy around them when they first go in. This was on the 8th of March, and people want to buy seed and plant seed on it. And of course, God knows where this seed's going to come from or what it's going to have in it. But if you wait, this was 6 months later, it will revegetate itself, and this vegetation that grows is going to be a far better value to wildlife than anything that you're going to have bought. And when I was doing the plans for nature, I kept finding I was using this term all the time: niches for nature. Nice alliteration to it. And what it was I was trying to get people to look at their property and all the little different niches where animals might be living, whether it's birds, insects, small mammals, frogs. And at the end of the day, nature quite likes complexity and structure. And this place was wonderful. I went and they were already doing a lot of wildlife friendly management. I thought, where am I going to actually find things that they can improve it? And I was surprised you can. But it's a good example of things you can look at. It's got mature trees in it. So that's great. It's creating structural diversity. It's got a lot of well-developed scrub and diverse scrub. That's going to provide a lot of fruit. Now, best of all, this place is managed already that it suits them. They've got their vegetable garden. They're developing a more formal seating area here. They've got their lawns, which actually are cut every 3 to 4 weeks. So they're heading towards short flowering meadow on those. They've got a lawn they've just developed for their grandchildren to play football on. They've got an area of wildflower meadow. They've got an area of unmanaged grassland. So again, if you can look at this, there's lots of different niches for nature. The ones that people don't always think about is the walls. Walls are brilliant for the amount of wildlife that lives in them. The gravel, you've got gravel, there's a ruined building here, so you've got lots of things living in the brickwork. Bats might be rooting. The cottage itself had bats living in it. So it's just about both looking at niches for nature and looking at different ways you can create more niches for nature. And at the end of the day, the things you're always going to have to be thinking about is how can you provide more food, water, shelter, and wildlife friendly management. So hopefully that's quite a brief overrun of it all. I'm hoping what it's going to do is give you some ideas and maybe the confidence to go out and start. As I say, it's better to make a start and do something to give nature a helping hand than do nothing at all. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sharon. You deserve a glass of water at least after that. That was amazing. That was so brilliantly all packed in and
That's great to have me
without a break. Without a break, that was brilliant. No one should have any questions after that. But there are two, and we'll only take two because we are over time.
I'm over time.
Yeah,
Sorry.
but that's okay. We started late, so the allowance was made for that. Just two questions. First was why a ditch or a bank by the hedge? You mentioned it's good to have a
It
ditch.
creates more structural it creates more structural diversity, essentially, and different angles. So you've got more things living in, you'll get more plants growing on the bank. If you've got a ditch, you've got water. And again, it's about adding in the structural diversity. Quite a lot of places that have got older hedgerows, particularly farmland, could look at renovating their hedges. And if they're doing it and there is a bank there, maybe renovate the bank as well.
Yeah, great. Clodagh has asked, I have small ponds, but no frogs have come. Although we used to have lots of frogs 10 or more years ago, have they decreased in numbers in the Burren?
It depends where you are. I have put my pond in and I have no frogs, but there are very few frogs around here. There are things that are causing problems in frogs. I don't know. There's chytrid fungus. I don't know how established it is in Ireland, to be honest, whether that's affected them, whether there's other things that are affecting them. So without actually seeing it or that, I couldn't really say, but I don't see many frogs where I am, so I don't really know. But funnily enough, you go into other areas that are quite dry in the Burren, and you do see them. But again, you might be getting some newts and other things around. So while it's nice to have frogs, there's lots of other things that are going to be using your pond as well.
Yeah.
And if you've got fish in it, of course, they're going to be eating your tadpoles.
Yeah. Very good. Well, Sharon, thank you very much for that. I know that took a lot of work and preparation to be able to pack it in such a short time. So 7 or 8 solid actions for nature and hopefully lots of inspiration. So thank you for doing that. We have a recording of your talk and hopefully we'll put that up soon on YouTube. So people who couldn't attend today will be able to attend it. But with that, thanks very much. Have a very good evening and see you soon.
Okay, thanks very much.